Hello, my friends. We're going to continue on with Fuzzy Mud. When we left off, Chad, missing. Tamaya, missing. Marshall, running into the woods, leaving school to go and find Tamaya. Let's continue on. Chapter 19, Wednesday, November 3rd, 1:10 p.m. Leaves continued to fall around Tamaya as she wandered through the trees, hoping to see anything that looked familiar from the day before. Then, at least, she'd know she was going in the right direction, but nothing stood out to her. Normally, she was very observant. She was good at noticing small details, but yesterday, she'd been so scared that she hadn't been able to focus on anything. All of her concentration had been devoted to keeping close to Marshall. The only thing she remembered seeing was the fuzzy mud. If she could find that, then maybe Chad was nearby. She tried to keep track of everything now. Tree stumps, twisted branches, rock formations. There was a tree with several planks of wood hammered into it. She made mental notes of everything she saw so that after she found Chad, she'd be able to find her way back. She stopped often. She turned around and then retraced her steps in her mind. "Chad!" she shouted. She didn't have a very loud or strong voice. Miss Filbert was constantly trying to get her to project. "You have a lot of good ideas, Tamaya. You need to speak with some authority." Whenever it was her turn to read aloud in the class, everyone always complained that they couldn't hear. And out on the playground, sometimes she'd shout at Monica or Hope, and they wouldn't hear her, even though they were just on the other side of the dodgeball circle. She tried again. This time, she put an extra little oomph behind it. "Chad!" The extra oomph just made her voice crack. She spotted a tree with white bark, just a few dead leaves on its branches. One of the branches seemed to be pointing the way back to school. She fixed that into her memory. A little beyond the tree, she noticed a dark, muddy area. There was a layer of scummy fuzz floating on top of it. She slowly made her way towards it. She didn't think it was the same puddle of mud from the other day. But she remembered now that she had been on the side of the hill. The ground around here was fairly level. She hooked her lunch sack onto the branch, then moved close to the mud. Just like before, there were no leaves on top of the mud, but they had fallen all around it. She knelt beside the edge of the puddle and could feel the warmth radiating from the fuzzy mud. Her skin tingled, but that might just been the heebie-jeebies playing tricks with her mind. She picked up a leaf about the same size of her hand. Holding it by the stem, she slowly lowered it into the mud. And she lowered it into the fuzz. When she lifted it back up, the top half was completely gone. She let it drop and then backed away as she stood up. She was getting her lunch sack when she saw another puddle of fuzzy mud just a little farther off. Beyond that, she could see what looked like two more. She returned to the white tree, its branches pointing the way back to school. It wasn't too late to go back. If she hurried, she might not even get in trouble. She could go see Mrs. Latherley, take an allergy pill, and get her hand rebandaged. Then Mrs. Latherley could give her a note excusing her for being late to class. The tree branch pointed one way. Tamaya went the other. "Chad!" she hollered. This time, her voice didn't crack. She continued deeper into the woods. 2 times 65,536 equals 131,072. 2 times 131,072 equals 262,144. Chapter 20. 3 months later. In February the following year, 3 months after Tamaya went back into the woods to search for Chad, the Senate Committee on Energy and the Environment held a new set of hearings. These hearings were not secret. By this time, the entire world knew about Sunray Farm, Bioline, and the disaster that had occurred at Heathcliff, Pennsylvania. Dr. Peter Smythe, Deputy Director of the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, gave the following testimony at these Heathcliff disaster hearings. Senator Wright, were you able to identify this microorganism? Dr. Peter Smythe, no, not at the time. It didn't match anything in our database. Senator Wright, had you or anyone else at the CDC seen this type of rash before? Dr. Peter Smythe, again, no. nor did we know how to treat it. There was no cure. Senator Wright: and so you ordered the quarantine? Dr. Peter Smythe: the president ordered the quarantine based off my recommendations. No one was allowed to leave Heathcliff or the surrounding areas. That included our own doctors and scientists. Once they entered the quarantine zone, they could not return. Thousands of people were infected. 5 people had already died, and the one found in the woods, and then 4 more who were infected later. Senator Foote: all because of one little girl? Dr. Peter Smythe: 1 week after Tamaya went into the woods, more than 500 people showed signs of the rash, including many of her classmates. But it would be wrong to assume that it was caused by Tamaya. The invading organisms had simply overwhelmed the environment. By the time the first snow fell, this so-called fuzzy mud had spread to lawns and flower beds all over Heathcliff. Chapter 21, Wednesday, November 3rd, 1:21 p.m. A dead tree lay on its side, partially propped up by its broken branches. An image flashed into Maya's head of Marshall standing on top of a tree that had fallen over. She hurried over to it. Up close, the tree seemed larger than she remembered. There was a thick branch sticking almost straight up from the trunk, with lots of smaller branches coming off of it. She doubted it was the same tree. Some of the bark crumbled away as she grabbed the base of the largest branch. She pulled herself up and looked around, just as Marshall had done. Ahead, the ground sloped steeply down to a gully. Rising up from the other sides of the gully were 2 hills. One of those hills could have been where they left Chad. She cupped her hands around her mouth like a megaphone and tried to make her tiny voice project across the vast woodlands. Chad! Her eyes scanned the 2 hillsides, hoping to see Marshall's rocky ledge, but all she could see were trees and more trees, so she hopped down. The ground went splat beneath her left foot. Even before she looked, she realized what she had done. She stared down in horror and she realized, oh my gosh, as she looked at her left foot, it was ankle deep in fuzzy mud. She tried to step free, but her foot wouldn't budge. The mud held tight. She could feel the warmth oozing through her sock. Her right foot had landed safely just on the edge of the mud puddle. She took a long stride back toward the fallen tree and grabbed one of the small dead branches. Its rough, pointy edges ripped through her blisters, and desperately she pulled with all of her might. The branch broke at the same moment her foot pulled free. She nearly fell backward into the mud, but managed to force her momentum sideways and landed on the dry, leaf-covered ground. She instantly yanked off her sneaker and then her muddy sock, and now had mud on her fingers and wiped them away on her sweater and skirt. She took off her sweater and used it as best as she could to clean up her leg and foot. She pulled the cloth back and forth between her toes and continued to rub it, even after she didn't even see the mud on her. She was more worried about what she couldn't see. She left her muddy sweater on top of the dead tree, lunch sack in hand, one shoe off, one shoe on. She continued down the slope towards the gully. Chad! 2 times 262,144 equals 524,288. 2 times 524,288 equals 1,048,576. Chapter 22. Wednesday, November 3rd, 1:45 p.m. At the beginning of each school year, a parent or guardian of every student at Woodridge Academy was required to fill out a bunch of forms. Among other things, they were to provide the school with various telephone numbers and emergency contact information. Those numbers were now being called grade by grade in alphabetical order. From inside her office, Mrs. Thaxton could hear Mr. Franks and Mrs. Latherley as they made one call after the other. "There's been an incident. Your child is perfectly safe. We're just taking extra precautions. No, we need you to personally pick up your daughter. Your babysitter's name is not on our files. If you want to fax or email your signed authorization. No decision has been made yet about tomorrow. We will be sending out a mass email." Mrs. Thaxton knew she should have been making the phone calls too, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She had just gotten off the phone with Tamaya's mother, who had telephoned the school after receiving Mrs. Latherley's message. No, she had not picked up Tamaya up after lunch. Yes, she knew about the rash and was planning on taking Tamaya to the doctor, but not until after school. What's this all about? Where's Tamaya? Tamaya's mother was on her way home now. Their best hope was that Tamaya maybe decided to go home after lunch without telling anyone. But they also knew that Tamaya wouldn't do that. Mrs. Thaxton's chin trembled and her eyes were blurry with tears. She blamed herself for not putting the school on lockdown the moment she'd heard that Chad Hilligus was missing. She should have done it right then. Better to be overreact than to underreact. But she knew the type of boy Chad was. Whatever had happened to him, wherever he was, she hadn't thought it had anything to do with the rest of the school. Not that she hadn't been concerned about him. She'd been very concerned. She just didn't take his disappearance as a danger sign for the other students. She remembered when Chad and his mother first came to her office. His mother wrote out a check for the tuition, handed it to her, and then, right in front of Chad, declared, "He's your problem now." Tamaya was different. She's the exact opposite of Chad. She was respectful to her teachers and considerate of others. She followed the rules. She was the type of student a teacher might easily ignore. And that, Mrs. Saxton now realized, might be why she'd gone missing without anyone noticing. Mrs. Thaxton shut her eyes very tight. She knew she had to be strong in the time of crisis. 2 missing children. 2 missing children in 2 days. She did not know yet that a 3rd child would also be discovered missing. She assumed Marshall was safely back in class. Mr. Davison assumed he was still with the head mistress. No one was worried about poor Marshall. Chapter 23. Wednesday, November 3rd, 2:00 p.m. The ground was mostly soft under Tamaya's cold bare foot, but she had to step carefully to avoid the sticks and sharp rocks buried beneath the fallen leaves. Her rash had spread the full length of her arm, and she could see the small red bumps on the other hand now, too. She tingled all over, although she couldn't be sure if it was caused by the mud or just her own heebie-jeebies. It seemed wherever she looked, there were more mud puddles. Yet, as bad as it was for her, she knew it had to be 10 times worse for Chad. At least she would have been able to get home yesterday. She'd been able to take a bath and change her clothes. "Chad!" She started to shout, then gasped and brought her hand almost over her mouth. Just ahead lay some kind of dead animal, half covered in muck and fuzz. She quickly turned her head away. It could have been a raccoon or possibly a small dog. The mud made it hard to know, and she didn't want to look. She made a wide circle around it, carefully watching every step before gently setting her foot down. She wondered if there was anybody else, anywhere, who knew about this fuzzy mud. She had tried to tell Mrs. Latherley, but the school nurse had been more worried about peanut butter. Even Marshall hadn't seemed to get it. Was it possible that she was the only one in the whole world who knew? The thought scared her, but it also what made her keep going. If not her, who? She was determined to make it to the hills on the other side of the gully. "Chad!" she outed. "Are you out here?" As the slope of the hill became steeper, she needed to grab onto branches to keep from losing her balance. She bounced from tree to tree, down towards the gully. There were fewer trees close to the gully, and the ground became even steeper. Tamaya could see directly down into the gully. It was more than half filled with fuzzy mud. She eased herself into the sitting position and rolled up onto the top of her lunch sack so that nothing would spill. She slid down towards the mud, using her sneakered foot as a brake to keep from going too fast. The ground was too steep and she started to turn sideways. She pulled at a clump of weeds to steady herself, but the weeds ripped right out of the ground and she flipped over onto her stomach. Her knees scraped across the jagged rocks, and then her foot slammed into a large boulder, finally stopping her. She clutched another clump of weeds to try and hold herself in place as she carefully moved her other foot to the boulder for more support. Looking over her shoulder, she saw that she was only a few feet from the edge of the gully. A thin layer of fuzzy scum rose up from it, like smoke. Not too far away, she could see the flat top of the rocks embedded in the dirt. It would make a good jumping-off spot. It looked to be about a 6-foot jump from one side of it to the other side of the gully. She moved crab-like, along the slope towards the flat-topped rock. She dug her fingernails into the dirt to keep from slipping. She knew she'd have to move quickly, and if she hesitated even for a second, she could end up in the mud. She pushed herself up, spun around, and slammed her sneakered foot down on the rock. She jumped and hit the other side, only inches above the mud. Using her momentum, she scrambled upwards, away from the gully. It wasn't until she was walking again, following a dry creek bed, that she noticed the pain from all the bruises on her arms, hands, knees, and legs. Her shirt had rolled up a bit during the slide, and she had scratches and scrapes all on her stomach as well. Still, she knew her pain was nothing compared to Chad's. Chad! The creek bed wound its way upwards between the two hills, and she could see the other side of the gully. She kept looking from one hill to the other, hoping to see Marshall's rocky ledge. Although she knew that even if she found it, that didn't mean that Chad would be nearby. Chad! Her throat was dry and weak, and her voice had gotten even weaker. For a second, she thought she heard something. She stopped. She listened. The woods were silent. Looking back the way she had come, she wondered if she'd ever even find her way out of there. She didn't want to cross the gully again. She heard a noise. Twigs were breaking, and then footsteps. The steps were uneven, like someone was stomping and staggering. Then she saw him. He crashed his way through the tangle of twigs and branches. She froze. "I'm here!" he called, but his voice was a little more than a raspy whisper. He took several steps, several deep, uneven breaths, and continued to push his way towards her. I'm here," he repeated weakly. His face was a mass of blisters, crusted with pus and dried blood, and was so badly swollen, so she could hardly even see his eyes. She started to bring her hand to her mouth and then stopped herself, not wanting to get a rash on her lips or tongue. He came closer. Where'd you go?" he called from only a few feet away. He sank to his knees. I'm right here," he whimpered. Where did you go?" She felt overwhelmed with feelings of horror, revolution, and pity. When she spoke softly. "Are you hungry?" 2 times 1,048,576 equals 2,097,152. 2 times 2,097,152 equals 4,194,304. And that's where we're going to pause, my friends. Tamaya has found Chad. Badly blistered, covered in pus and crusted blood, and his face so swollen she can hardly even see his eyes at all. Tune in with me in a few hours, and we're going to see what happens next with our friends. Chad and Tamaya have been reunited in the woods. Check in with me in a bit, and we'll keep going. Bye, my friends. Have a beautiful afternoon.